Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating political idea, one that promises an incredible amount of freedom, but, well, it might just have a fatal flaw baked right into its design. We're talking about minarchism.
So let's just get right to the heart of it with one big question. Could you have a government whose only job is to protect you and provide a justice system? Could something like that actually work in the real world?
All right, let's dig into the promise here. Because on the surface, it's a really appealing idea. It's often called the night watchman state. You know, a government that basically punches the clock, makes sure everyone's safe, and then just gets out of the way.
The official name for this is minarchism, and it pushes for what it calls an ultra-minimal state. The government gets exactly two legitimate functions: security, so your military and police, and justice, which means the court system. And that's it, full stop. Everything else, roads, schools, healthcare, you name it, that all gets handled by the private sector, by businesses, charities, or maybe just local communities.
Now, the most famous argument for this actually came from the philosopher Robert Nozick, and his thinking was really interesting. He figured that if you had no state at all, you just have a bunch of private defense agencies competing with each other, and eventually one would win out and become a kind of dominant monopoly, basically a private government that you'd have zero control over. So for Nozick, this minimal state was a kind of necessary evil. Yeah, it's a monopoly on force, but at least it's one that we the citizens can supposedly control.
And it's so important to get this. Minarchism isn't just another flavor of small government. Classical liberalism, for example, also wanted a small state, but it was fine with it doing things like managing the currency or building some public infrastructure. Minarchism is way more radical than that. It doesn't just want to limit the size of the government, it wants to strictly limit the types of things a government is ever allowed to do, period.
Okay, so on paper, it sounds so simple, right? So clean. But this is where we find the first major crack in this whole beautiful blueprint. And it all boils down to how you define a single, simple word. Think about it. If the government's only legitimate function is to provide security, what does that word actually mean? Where do you stop? It sounds easy, but as you'll see, that question is a real can of worms. The entire theory is built on these two pillars, right? Security and justice. They sound so solid, so straightforward, but one of them turns out to be, well, a lot more flexible and slippery than it first appears.
And this is where the idea can really start to stretch and unravel. Because once you start talking about security, a clever politician could justify almost anything. I mean, couldn't a government argue it needs to control agriculture for food security or manage oil reserves for natural resource security? What about creating welfare programs to ensure social stability or a huge health agency to protect public health from pandemics? All of a sudden, your ultra-minimal state is, well, it's building roads and running the economy, all under the banner of security?
This just opens up a flood of massive unanswered questions. How much do you spend on defense? Are we talking nuclear submarines or just rifles for a local militia? When it comes to justice, are we talking fines or jails or something else? There's just no clear objective line. And that clean, simple blueprint, it starts to get real messy, real fast.
But let's say, just for the sake of argument, you could somehow solve that definition problem. Even then, you run smack into another fundamental challenge. How big should this state be, geographically?
Seriously, the theory doesn't really say. Should there be one single minarchy for the entire planet? Or should we stick with the roughly 195 countries we have now? Just, slim down. Or maybe we should have thousands of tiny competing city-states.
And look at how vast the difference is between these models. You could have a single world state, the map we all recognize today, or a chaotic patchwork of thousands of little microstates. The answer you pick completely changes everything about how this system would work.
And here's the real trap. If you let any group just secede and start their own minarchy whenever they want, well, you end up right back with competing defense agencies, which is the very thing Nozick was trying to avoid. But if you don't allow secession, you might need a single, all-powerful world state to enforce the rules and stop people from breaking away. It's a huge contradiction right at the core of the idea.
So, that brings us to the final and maybe the most practical problem of them all. Let's pretend for a second that minarchism is the perfect system. How on earth would we get there from here?
This might just be the biggest hurdle of all. Because, it's one thing to design a utopia on a whiteboard. It's another thing entirely to try and build it in the messy, complicated world we actually live in.
The journey faces two, let's call them, mountains. First, you have to convince billions of people to give up the state protections they have now, flawed as they may be, for a totally unknown future. Good luck.
And second, you have to convince the very people in power to voluntarily hand over their influence, their wealth, and their jobs.
To even attempt to climb those mountains, you wouldn't just need supporters. You would need a movement of true believers, people with an almost religious level of conviction, who are willing to sacrifice pretty much everything, their careers, their money, maybe even their freedom, for the cause.
And that makes you think of someone like Irvin Schiff. This was a man who died in federal prison because he refused to pay any income tax, an act he saw as radically immoral. He made the ultimate sacrifice for his ideal. But ask yourself, would he have done all that for just a simple tax cut, for a slightly smaller government? The source makes a great point here. Is the prize of a minimal state actually compelling enough to inspire that kind of life-altering sacrifice?
So that's what we're left with. We have to ask, is minarchism a stable, practical blueprint for a freer society? Or is it more like an elegant, beautiful idea on paper that just kind of crumbles the moment you start asking the hard questions? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining the Explain.